Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's session. We're going to be introducing that here in a second. I just want to say hi. My name is Angie Furman, and I'm the River Training Center Coordinator for River Management Society. I'm going to be helping out kind of behind the scenes today. So if you have any technical difficulties, you're welcome to send me a message and reach out, and I'll help you troubleshoot those. But a little introduction. We've got a series. This is a 4-part series here for you on hydropower. And this series is really delving into some of the basics of hydropower projects, hydropower's role in the energy market, its role in providing ancillary services to the grid, and trends and changes in the licensing process over the last 30 years. So this series builds upon the foundation laid out in the Hydropower Licensing 101 Toolkit. I'm going to provide a link to that here in the chat. And this was published in 2023 by River Management Society, National Park Service, and the Hydropower Reform Coalition. And I'm putting a link there in the chat so you can check that out. And in this series is just to help fill in some of those gaps of that toolkit. So a few key reminders today. We are recording today's session and we will be sending it out afterwards in an email. I'll also be compiling any of the links shared in the chat or any other additional resources that are shared and email those out to you as well. We'll also be posting it on the RMS YouTube channel. We have a hydropower playlist, which I'll also put a link to here in the chat, where you can find any of our previous sessions that we held on March 13th and March 20th. And today we are going to be talking about trends in relicensing and looking at some of the evolution challenges and lessons learned. We're going to have some time for Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, you can put those into the chat and then we'll get to them. We'll also have some time for you to raise your hand and we'll get to those at the end. So now I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Risa. She's going to talk a little bit about our agenda and then introduce us to today's presenters.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Risa Shimoda. I'm the Executive Director of the River Management Society and thrilled that there are lots of people here today wanting to know about the what you see on today's agenda. And if any of the bullet points sound a little weird, you will understand why when you hear the speakers. I guarantee it. So we're first going to reflect on the early days of the first kind of era of the public getting involved in hydropower licensing in the United States. And then today's environment with those who have been working on hydropower from a variety of perspectives, as a lot of things in this area have evolved and shifted, both in terms of what happens and who is involved. And then what's ahead. There'll be sort of a panel discussion of what we should be anticipating. If you work in the hydropower, regardless of who you work for, if it's agency or if you're an NGO, what's ahead? Because the landscape has changed and probably will continue to change as our world of energy changes. Then we'll have a little bit of Q&A at the end. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We'll probably hold off on responding to them until the end, unless it's something really pertinent to what someone is saying, like I didn't understand what that acronym was or something like that. So we don't want to hold up on things that will become irrelevant at the end. But I think we'll have ample time. So here are 4 of our 9 presenters today. And I hope you'll indulge me. You'll see these guys in the screens. But first will be Pope Barrow, who's an energy environmental law attorney for the House of Representatives of Legislative Council and chief legislative council person there. He was also a former board member of ADEB, American Whitewater, author of Rivers at Risk, a guide to how hydropower relicensing, and author of what he says is a best-selling memoir, I Should Have Been More Careful. He experienced many failed attempts to keep Pete Skinner calm and peaceful, coordinating all early Golly festivals, as well as numerous other fundraisers for American Whitewater, back in the day. Now he's retired from absolutely everything other than playing pickleball and racing sailboats. I wanted to share, though, this is from a speech from then Congressman Markey from Massachusetts, who's now senator, and in saying, Madam Speaker, speaking to Nancy Pelosi in 2009, he lauded Pope as his own pontiff of paper and the sixth House Legislative Council since the office was created in 1918. Pope contributed, and this I'm quoting from his comments, quote, Pope contributed to the War Powers Act, the Clean Air Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, Solid Waste Disposal Act, the Superfund Law, Public Utilities Regulatory Policy Act, various amendments to the Federal Power Act, Energy Policy Act 1992, 2005, and 2000, Energy Independence and Security Act in 2007. He was the principal draftsman of the National Parks and Recreation Act of 1978 and the Alaska Lands Act. In case he seems too goofy because he's just playing pickleball now. So I just wanted to mention that because he is, his story will be short, but his footprint is long and he's really important to the story. Now, Pete Skinner, while catching polluters of New York rivers as chief scientist, environmental bureau for the New York State Attorney General's office by day, Pete inaugurated the practice of representing the public's interest in seeing rivers flow again from behind hydropower dams at night and on weekends during the 80s and 90s. By learning how rivers are regulated, Pete's capacity for analysis as a scientist and engineer and his optimistic enthusiasm for doing what's right fueled an inspired cohort such that terms of licenses for hundreds of rivers on which hydropower dams were built or planned were reviewed by dozens of paddlers and anglers across the country. All members of the public enjoy both creeks and spectacular canyons across the U.S. year-round, according to calendars and predictably posted schedules today, thanks to Pete and the doors he opened. The work continues, creating year-round opportunities to enjoy what without him would be dry rivers for millions of people, and his work will benefit people for generations to come. Next is Bruce Carpenter, who's educated in the New York University system, majoring in environmental and political science. He was a grassroots organizer and lobbyist, member and active of the New York State's Open Space Plan, Northern Forest Alliance, Great Lakes Advisory Council, and Clean Water Network. And in his hydro work, he was the founding director of New York Rivers United and an original member of the National Hydropower Reform Coalition. Tom Christopher, one of the founding directors of New England Flow, the first organized coalition of recreation boating groups in the Northeast U.S. He directed communications to establish the organization with a high political profile in state and federal agencies around New England. And he organized development of the Deerfield Settlement Agreement, a major environmental victory in New England. He sat on the board of AW also for 14 years and participated in the founding of the Hydropower Reform Coalition, with which he has been participating for 30 years. And there's more. So thanks again for indulging me. Bob Nasdor, who has the best picture of all of you guys, has been American Whitewater's Northeast Stewardship Director based out of Massachusetts since 2012, an avid paddler of the rivers of the Northeast who brings a wealth of experience to the position from his 20-year career as a public interest attorney, executive and legal director for programs aimed at improving policies and services benefiting low-income and homeless families. He also held the position of Assistant Attorney General in the state of Massachusetts and has a private law practice, furthering his interest in advocacy, legislative reform, grassroots organizing, and outreach. Kevin Mendick, next, is an environmental protection specialist with the Northeast region of the National Park Service, where he's worked since 1990 in the area of hydropower, environmental compliance, and permitting. In his role as a conservation administrator for the town of Lexington, Mass., his primary responsibility involved compliance with the Massachusetts Wetlands Protection Act. He holds a law degree and master's degree from Vermont Law School and is a member of the Massachusetts Bar. Next, Teresa Lorejo Simpson brings over 2 decades of river advocacy experience to the position of California Stewardship Director for American Whitewater. Since started paddling in 1999, she's made it a point to get involved at the community level to advocate for riversheds and lands in her backyard. Teresa cut her teeth in the world of hydro by encouraging advocacy from local paddling groups for relicensing of the FERC Upper American River Project, owned and operated by Sacramento Municipal Districts, or SMUD. She helped implement the first license-required recreational flow releases by SMUD on the South Fork American, below Slab Creek Dam, and below Silver Creek, an icehouse reservoir. In 2022, Teresa stepped forward to chair the California Hydropower Coalition. 2 more. Mark Zakatansky is the Director of Conservation Policy with the Appalachian Mountain Club, or AMC, and leads their engagement in river conservation and hydropower. With a mission to foster the protection, enjoyment, and understanding of the outdoors, AMC has been active in the hydropower licensing arena since the 1980s in Northeast, and in hydropower as a founding member of the HRC as well, where they still play a leadership role. Mark's engagement in specific projects over the years, along with his predecessor, Ken Kimball, have been instrumental in securing large-scale mitigation funding agreements, such as on the Connecticut River, and for securing new public access and flows for paddlers on rivers from the Kennebec in Maine, the Deerfield in Massachusetts, the Mon Gap in New York, and many more in between. And finally, Alex Barham is an environmental scientist and safety professional with decades of experience in regulatory compliance. Alex has been the organizer of numerous river festivals, creating charitable fundraising projects, and been the local spearhead for American Whitewater and the Appalachian Mountain Club's dam relicensing projects in the state of New York. Alex is also heavily involved in exploring new avenues to hold licensees accountable while protecting the interests of the river systems and their paddlers. So if you've made it this far, the rest is easy. So I want to thank these guys and Teresa for getting organized and telling the stories, and I think you'll find it really, really interesting. We appreciate your being here. Okay, take it away, Pope.
Okay, thank you, everyone, and thank you, Risa, for that exhaustive introduction. I'm very honored to be a part of this impressive group and start things off. I am a retired lawyer. I spent 4 decades writing federal and energy and environmental laws in Congress. And the next slide will show a picture of where, right there on the right side, you'll see where my office was. But I had other interests as well. I was a whitewater kayaker for many years. And so what I want to do is give everyone a bird's eye view of what this is all about, a view from outer space, which is where I am now. Let's start with the beginning, when dinosaurs roamed the earth. Rivers ran free. But eventually, people realized they could make money by building dams for private profit. Lots of rivers got dammed. No pun intended. Some folks objected when their beloved rivers turned into dead lakes and poisonous mudflats. A few handled the problem with some sticks of dynamite, as they did in this location in Idaho. It was the Wild West. So in 1920, the Federal Power Act was enacted to bring the marshal into Dodge. It was the first of several federal laws governing private power producing dams. 3 of those laws are the Federal Power Act of 1920, the Public Utility Regulatory Policies Act of 78, that's PURPA, the Electric Consumers Protection Act of 1986, that's ECPA. The 1920 Power Act established the Federal Power Commission. It said that non-governmental private dams for electric generation could be built only if licensed and in the public interest. Utilities got very busy then, building dams all over the place with few constraints. Then in 1978, FERPA came along, gave the green light to non-utility power production. By green light, I'm talking about greenback dollar bills. Things quickly got out of whack. Hundreds of new projects were proposed by every Tom, Dick, and Harry in town. FERC was flooded with applications. Even utilities were getting upset by all the competition. Meanwhile, hundreds of old existing utility hydro projects were coming up for relicensing. River users, whitewater kayakers, rafters, fishermen soon noticed a lot of free-flowing rivers and releases from dams were threatened by this gold rush. And there was a growing public awareness of the negative ecological effects of dams. The Federal Power Commission, renamed FERC, was coming under scrutiny in Congress. Congress was curious, what the hell is going on over there? The chairman of the House, the powerful House Energy Committee, was John Dingell. FERC had always seen electric power production synonymous with the public interest, but Dingell disagreed. I was assigned to write energy legislation for Chairman Dingell. Dingell wanted to come up with language to bring in more balance. In the Electric Consumers Protection Act of '86, we attempted to do that. Section 4E required that equal consideration be given to the preservation of recreational, ecological, and other values of natural rivers. And nice words, if I do say so myself. But nice words were not enough to get the job done. Kayakers were worried. We started looking around for how to slow down the degradation and loss of the rivers we love. But not every environmentalist saw free-flowing rivers as beautiful, exciting jewels of nature, as we did. We went first to American Rivers. They stood for river conservation nationwide. They had money, big donors. I pestered the heck out of them, but they had their hands full with other issues, no staff, funding, or appetite to fight with big utilities. Other environmental organizations had the same attitude. Some even thought that hydropower was green energy. Scary. They forgot the golden rule. As Albert Einstein said, there's no free lunch in energy production. Or maybe that was Yogi Berra said that. However, there did exist a tiny, nearly comatose organization, American Whitewater Affiliation, as it was known back then. It was basically bankrupt. Published a small magazine, also on its deathbed. But it did have a few very committed members, among whom was that notorious maniac, Pete Skinner. Pete was at least as pissed off about hydropower as I was. He ranted about it in the AWA Journal. I heard Pete howling at the moon, and I told him we needed, if we're going to make a difference, we needed publicity, funding, membership, manpower, and an aggressive organization. Pete was all in. Next, so we conspired to revive the American Whitewater Affiliation and focus it on hydropower projects affecting whitewater. A tiny bankrupt organization was not going to be effective. So Pete took off to California to see the billionaire Yvon Chouinard. Came back with a bag of loot. That really got things going. American Whitewater got an office, hired dedicated staff, raised money, upgraded the magazine, expanded our membership, ran festivals such as the Gully. Other groups jumped in, regional river groups developed, especially in California, New York, and New England. Then American Rivers had a change of leadership and a change of heart. They jumped into the game in a big way. With their lawyer, John Echeverria, we wrote a book on how citizens could contest unwise hydro projects. That book, Rivers at Risk, is still available. Now we're back where we were before all this happened, freeing up rivers like the Klamath, but now it can be done legally. Thanks, everyone. Now we'll hear from the real warriors.
Thanks, Pope. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I hope you can. It should come as no surprise that I would become the ardent whitewater enthusiast that I became in the 1970s, because I grew up on the banks of the Medowee River in southern Vermont, and I spent my youth swimming there, fishing there, and falling in the snow. But you know, it wasn't just the river that set me on the course to try to make a difference for rivers long term. It was my mom, who was an indomitable advocate for the community interests, and my dad made the bamboo fishing rod that Orvis sold. And so it's not off the ground I licked it that I would get really excited about going down the river in a boat and learning about American Whitewater Affiliation (AWA) that was really struggling along, and I offered to help. And it would be also no surprise that I would end up having to heed the call to try to save our rivers from ruin, especially in New York. In the beginning, next slide. In the beginning, I thought that these rivers were a public resource everybody could enjoy and everybody would cherish and everybody would protect. But when I grew older, I realized that some hydro projects, many of them, actually drained or flooded that same free flowing river, blocked public access, messed up ecosystems, and eliminated flowing water recreation, better known as kayaking. And they disfigured these beautiful natural waterways that I grew up on. And paddling whitewater brought me face to face with these impacts. By the way, paddling is different than golf. Uh, why? Because out on the river, you have to rely on one another for safety and knowledge about the runs. And those things build a great sense of camaraderie that lasts for all your lives. It changes who you are. Next slide. So in the 1970s, I was like kayaking all the time. I didn't spend time doing much of anything else in my free time, and the Moose River was where I loved to go. This is Agar Falls here, one of our favorite spots. And the reason we could do this is because kayak construction evolved from fiberglass to plastic, and these plastics didn't crack. But as this evolution took place, we went from regular rapids, you all know, to waterfalls. And boy, that changed everything. The AWA Journal would have articles all the time about it, and people started coming from all around to test their skills on these rapids. And a little problem occurred. That was exactly where independent power producers, goaded on by PURPA and a 6-cent law in New York, came to visit as well. They wanted access to these waterfalls because they could produce power and make money. We realized right off the bat there'd be conflict, so we reached out to these independents and began negotiating directly with them, but soon realized that this kind of negotiation took place in front of FERC, or at least assisted by it. And so we ended up putting down our paddles and picking up our pencils, because without these resources, what we loved would be gone. We intervened in dozens of project proceedings. We tried to figure out how the FERC process worked. We worked with resource agencies, and we worked to kill those incentives that attracted so many companies to this resource, especially in the Adirondacks, where it's very steep. The rivers are, that is. And we formed New York Rivers United, and we hired Bruce Carpenter to attend the meetings that would go all day. And we just didn't have enough vacation days to do every meeting. Next slide. So years flew by, let me tell you, as we battled first the independent power producers, and then right on their heels, relicensing the existing plants that there were a lot of, especially in the Adirondacks. And you can see by these pictures, what we hoped would be a small impact project turned out to have a lot of concrete, a lot of blasted bedrock, and dry riverways that we no longer had access to. And we did everything we could do, but it wasn't enough. And thankfully, we have another bite at the apple as relicensing is coming up now. Next slide. Well, did we get a job done? Yes, we did. we negotiated water releases, minimum flows, access, and some visual mitigation. And still, paddlers, even today, 30 years after we inked these agreements, paddlers are still flocking to these rivers. And we feel very, very fortunate that the releases are there, and we gather together thanks to Alex and others on these festivals to celebrate what we were able to accomplish. And they're getting relicensed again. And so we will be back in doing the job that we did 30 years ago. Hopefully, we'll do it better, and that we'll get these projects better adapted to a comprehensive plan for the river. Next slide. Okay, what did we learn? It was pretty simple. You first had to have all the knowledge you could possibly have about these projects. Be the best informed party in these proceedings. You have a better chance of getting better outcomes. Next. We also realized that you had to have a clear purpose about what you wanted to achieve by participating, and passionate about what you wanted to do, because passion and persistence really pay great dividends. And by the way, you need money, you need consultants, you need time to attend all these meetings. It's almost impossible to do it just on your vacation. And you need a network of smart people to lend their hand. Next one. And so to wrap it all up, what we found was participants and their agendas, you got to find common ground. You got to show up at the meetings, and you got to remain attentive, because everybody's taking time off to be part of this. And you got to be respectful. You got to suggest outcomes and ideas that will bring common ground, and never give up. Just keep pushing every button you need to get the job done. The future of rivers really is in all of your hands, not so much me, because I got other things I want to do. But together with others, we will determine the future of these beautiful riverine resources we have in New York and New England and all over America. Thank you.
So I guess I'm up now. Bruce Carpenter, past director for New York Rivers United. And well, it's not on this first slide. I've got to tell you that how this actually started. As I was sitting in my cubicle selling cars, this little bald head guy came running into the dealership, screaming and yelling and making absolutely no sense about a lifetime opportunity, and that I had to quit my job, had $10,000, and go form an organization. How that actually convinced me, I don't know, but I guess I would have followed Pete Skinner over a cliff. I didn't have any of the knowledge that Pope and Pete talked about. I was a resource advocate. I'm just a lobbyist. My job initially was to form a coalition. I went out to all of my friends who I'd worked with and formed, and they all supported us. The Adirondack Council, New York Audubon, the Association for the Protection of the Adirondacks. Well, it didn't mean much to me at the time. It would eventually. None of these organizations had any idea what relicensing was, nor did they know where we were going with it or how we would accomplish it. But we all signed on to a document and to try to move it forward. Richard Roos Collins was an attorney in California. He was assigned to me to help me with interventions. He called me up and said, pick out the best rivers you have. I'm going to send you blank interventions and just fill them out and send them in. Well, again, let's go back before. I have no idea what the best rivers are. I have no idea what the overall interests were. So I intervened in all of them. This put us as a major party in a 401 case. Some 4 weeks later, after the Tacoma case was decided, we were invited all to Albany to sit down and figure out exactly how we would go forward. All of us, I say, was the agencies, New York State DEC, Fish and Wildlife, the National Park Service, all of the hydro developers in the state. There were 7 of them at the time that had 47 dams, and New York Rivers United and me. But because we had 100,000 people supporting us from all of these organizations, we were granted full and complete access to everything. We were told to go out and try to start coming up with settlements. We were given a time frame initially. That time frame, though, had to depend on who could do what. The New York State DEC had 5 people, Fish and Wildlife had 2 people, National Park Service had 1, and I had 1. And so we set up a time frame from the lowest point being me, and we started off to negotiate 47 different projects. And again, at the start of this, I had no idea what the key components were. I only knew that we had a major interest in this. Over the next 10 years, the team that I'm talking about formed such collaboration that we knew when everybody played golf, we knew whose kids had to be picked up, we knew everything about each other, and we knew how to get things done. We were able to achieve settlements on every single 401 case and then actually move forward from there. Some of the settlements, what did we get? Again, remember I had no idea at the time. Riverine habitat, thousands of acres of land, fish screen almost everywhere, downstream fish passage, whitewater access, impoundment fluctuations, public access, public resources, and river funds. We went from having no idea to having some of the best outcomes that could be forward. I don't know if any of this can be duplicated in any way. We had a great camaraderie with the agencies and really worked very well with them. But times have changed. I hope it hasn't changed for the worse.
Thank you, Bruce. Welcome, everyone. And I'm very pleased to do a little walk down memory lane about the work that we completed in New England. So between 1994 and 2004, stakeholders completed settlement agreements on 6 different river systems in Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Massachusetts. And the Deerfield River was the first. And as you can see from the slide, it became the model, but with 8 dams, with 140 megawatt Yankee Row nuclear power plant, which has now been decommissioned, and a 600 megawatt Bear Swamp pump storage project, it certainly was a challenge. Back in 1987, when the dams came up for relicensing, a small group of kayakers met with New England Power and respectfully asked if we could possibly get 6 or 8 days of whitewater releases in the summer months so that we could enjoy the river resources as well. And basically, we were shown the door. So over the next 2 years, between 1988 and 89, this group of kayakers went about building a boating coalition that was going to deal with the relicensing of the dams on the Deerfield. And this coalition included American Whitewater, the Appalachian Mountain Club, American Rivers, the American Canoe Association, the U.S. Whitewater Team, and some local canoe and kayak clubs like the Merrimack Valley Paddlers and the Rhode Island Canoe and Kayak Clubs. When we started to meet with New England Power, the meetings were immediately adversarial. And as other stakeholders came to the table that included state and federal agencies and certainly fisheries interests and some watershed groups and other landowners, each one of them added more conflict with New England Power. And clearly, in those days, there was more than its share of conflict amongst the stakeholder groups themselves. And this muddled along for a number of years. I mean, there was really not much progress on the Deerfield up until about 1991. And some very important things happened in 1991. First of all, New England Flow sent a letter to John Rowe, who was the president, I believe may have also been chairman of the board of New England Power. And in the letter, we complained about the performance of the New England Power staff and how they were not cooperative and how they were more likely to be obstructive rather than to work in concert with each other. There was very shortly thereafter a change in staff, and two other important things happened. Dr. Kenneth Kimball, the research scientist from the Appalachian Mountain Club, joined our negotiating team, and he quickly pointed out that it was going to be very difficult to come to any kind of agreement until we started using hard science and solid economic data, which would lead to appropriate studies. The other thing that happened was John Echevarria from American Rivers in DC came up to visit us. And John would stay at my home and would get up and have breakfast in the morning and drive out to Western Massachusetts to meet the rest of the negotiating team. And we would then move forward from that point on. Between 92 and 94, things improved tremendously. We were able to accomplish a lot of studies and a lot of good things got done. People got more comfortable working with each other and collaborate. And in 1994, 13 signatories came to the table to sign the Deerfield Settlement Agreement. And for the kayakers' interest, the settlement agreement gave them 32 releases on Monroe Bridge section and 106 releases on the Fife Brook section. And quite frankly, on any summer weekend day, you can go up to the Deerfield and easily count 1,000 people using the river. And it doesn't matter whether they're kayakers or tubers or rafters or canoeists. It has had a huge positive economic impact on the town of Charlemont and certainly many other positive regional outcomes as well. Not only were we working on the Deerfield, and this is a great picture of the signatories of that first settlement agreement. Not only were we working on the Deerfield, but we were also drawn into the relicensings in Maine, most notably with Central Maine Power on the Kennebec River and the upper Androscoggin watershed rivers of the Rapid and the McGalloway. And a little bit later on, we also got drawn into the Canada Falls Penobscot storage projects, which had never been licensed, and FERC had now indicated that they needed licenses. CMP was like New England Power Company, an old guard company, and they had imposed a $1 access fee to private boaters if they wanted to walk across their property to access the river. And they clearly did not like out-of-staters. There was immediate conflict. It was really, really difficult. They took no prisoners. And as the stakeholders gathered, this now included commercial rafting companies who had their own share of conflicts directly with Central Maine Power. But after many, many years of studies, we finally agreed on what could work. And after 12 years, the groups signed a settlement agreement that provided better outcomes in water management. It expanded land protection substantially. It improved fisheries and provided enhancements to the fisheries, and certainly many, many other recreational amenities as well. Later on, New England Flow and stakeholders engaged with the relicensing of the lower dams on the Connecticut River. And again, after 12 years of negotiating and studies, we were able to sign a couple of settlement agreements in 2022. So what have we learned from the relicensings? Well, first of all, dam owners' authority can be challenged in relicensing, but you need to push for studies. you can't back down. You need good science. You need accurate economic analysis. If you're going to make meaningful decisions and acquire resource balance, all these are contingent on working together. We returned water to the river. In a lot of cases, minimum flows were very, very inadequate. So we were able to double and triple those. In one case on the Deerfield, we had an endangered orchid species growing in a driveway that had not seen water in years. And we were able to have that transplanted so that we could add water to that river. And certainly, as some of my colleagues have previously stated, you need to learn to compromise for the better good. You need to learn to work together. You need to learn to be respectful for each other. But collectively, all of these early settlement agreements and the difficulty it was to achieve them protected thousands of acres of land, many, many miles of rivers, and provided millions of dollars for fisheries and recreation, and also for some ecological restoration and many other public benefits. I'd like to thank everybody, and now I'll hand it over to Tree.
Thanks, Tom. Wow, it's hard to follow that act, but here we are, Bob, Kevin, Mark, Alex, and myself, the direct beneficiaries of all the hydropower groundwork that was laid out before us. So I want to say thank you, Pope, Peter, Bruce, and Tom. You've given us so much. So in our segment of this discussion, we are going to touch on today's environment. We're going to cover a little bit about advocacy in a more formalized process. We're going to talk about the changing relationships with dam owners. We're going to get into agency relationships, specifically the National Park Service. We're going to cover a case study, Pacific Gas and Electric's Kirkhoff Hydropower Project. And then we will wrap up our segment with a fishbowl panel of what's ahead. So let's get started with Bob.
Bob, you're on mute.
I'm sorry about that. Listening to all of this, you start to appreciate that progress is made in, it's measured in decades or generations. And we continue the work of really some extraordinary individuals that you've heard from. So following the groundbreaking advocacy of the folks in the last panel, relicensing became a more formalized process, and they helped in the development of what is now called the Integrated Licensing Process, or ILP. A lot of the smaller projects continue to use what's called the traditional licensing process, which involves little in the way of formal consultation in the completion of studies or the preparation of the license application. The ILP formalized the consultation requirements and created deadlines for stakeholder engagement, beginning with the filing of the notice of intent and pre-application document that begins the relicensing process 5 to 5.5 years before license expiration. For us, it changed the way in which we advocated. We had to become better at it, understand the process. And for us, we need to make sure our voices were heard in this new process and at every step in the relicensing process. And I've tried to summarize that here on the slide. There are just so many opportunities. I've kind of hit on the highlights here, but it is quite an extended process. When I started working for American Whitewater 12 years ago, it was just after Tom came to me with the Connecticut River relicensing. We're now in our 12th year of that relicensing, and we're not done yet. And I'm not quite sure we're going to be done soon. So we've gotten very good at the process. But with that said, the dam owners have also gotten very good at it. So in some ways, our process has become more challenging over the years. The pre-filing process refers to the first 3 years and is dominated by the development and implementation of study plans. We regularly propose studies dealing with recreation and whitewater boating, aesthetics, project operations, and economics, and support studies dealing with aquatic habitat. We propose studies that scientifically measure how fun it is to go whitewater boating or how enjoyable it is to view a beautiful waterfall. It's common for dam owners who often propose no studies in the hope that FERC will just approve continued operations to oppose our studies or try to limit their scope. And we advocate, often through FERC docket battles, over study plans before FERC makes its final study plan determination. We do our best to work with dam owners on study implementation. We work to form working groups to refine study methods and instruments, recruit study participants, such as whitewater boaters, for controlled flow studies, and we comment on study reports. For us, I think the challenge is that the consultants that are hired by the dam owners, unsurprisingly, are usually biased and dismissive of the environmental effects of those hydropower projects. So we spend a lot of time criticizing those study reports or providing other data so that when FERC does its NEPA analysis, they have a complete picture of project effects. And again, that's not to say that all dam owners are bad or that some don't take the responsibility seriously. But I think, as we'll describe, it's becoming increasingly rare with the consolidation of ownership. The process becomes even more formal after the license application gets filed, and we continue our engagement by making specific recommendations for protection, mitigation, and enhancement measures in response to draft and final license applications, making additional information requests, intervening and filing comments on the NEPA assessment of the projects, seeking rehearing, and if necessary, judicial appeal. We engage in the ILP process at least 24 times or more through our comments and showing up at in-person meetings. Last year, I spent a week up in Millinocket, Maine, on the Penobscot relicensing for the updated study report meeting. There's nothing like being at the projects to really understand and appreciate it, but I will say there's not a lot of exciting nightlife in Millinocket. We estimate, one of my colleagues estimated that it takes about 1,000 hours to participate in a complex relicensing lasting 5 or 10 or more years, and could even involve challenges to the state water quality certification, FERC rehearing, or even judicial appeal. I do want to say a few words about the role of states who certify that FERC licensed hydropower projects meet state water quality standards under Section 401 of the Clean Water Act. States are taking a more active role in 401 and are denying certification more frequently where dam owners haven't shown that their operations will protect water quality standards. States are also much more willing to grant certification with conditions rather than waiving their 401 authority. And as advocates, we participate in the 401 process through commenting on 401 applications and draft certifications. We fight to strengthen states' 401 authority through commenting on new regulations, filing court challenges to bad regulations that undermine their authority, and intervening in or filing cases to defend them. And we're currently litigating to support their authority to require dam removal rather than dam abandonment. But we also hold state 401 agencies accountable where they've taken an overly narrow view of the scope of their authority and have failed to protect designated and existing uses under their water quality standards and anti-degradation policies. And we encourage them to exercise their authority to mandate license conditions addressing the effects of the project activity as a whole. I now move to the next slide. I now want to talk a little bit about one project that really illustrates the kind of collaborations and working together that we've really needed to do. And this is the Connecticut River projects, both in Turner's Falls, Massachusetts, as well as upstream in Bellows Falls on the Vermont-New Hampshire border. Success in relicensing depends on collaboration among resource agencies and NGO stakeholders. I saw, looking at the list of folks who are here today, that there are quite a few resource agency folks here, and I can't stress strongly enough the importance of collaboration. Viewing our interests narrowly only serves the interests of dam owners who inevitably seek to divide and conquer and maintain the status quo. So for NGOs, this means recognizing that there may be a need to balance particular recreation interests with other resource objectives and recognizing the interconnectedness of issues. And for resource agencies, you should all appreciate and support the efforts of your NGO partners, who are often in the forefront of advocacy, less constrained by political considerations, and more willing to mount challenges and push for regulatory and legislative changes. It means all of us advocating for flow regimes that fairly balance stakeholder interests and avoiding partial settlements that address certain needs while ignoring others. And to illustrate this interconnectedness, on the Connecticut River, every image on this slide has a direct bearing on my advocacy for whitewater boating and recreation interests. Restoring flows to dewatered natural bypass reaches provides both whitewater boating and restores aquatic habitat for both resident and migratory fish species. Protects spawning for endangered short-nosed sturgeon. Removing lowhead dams opens recreation opportunities, eliminates safety hazards, and facilitates fish passage and access to habitat. Restoring a natural flow regime means more than providing minimum flows. It requires providing variable flows with aquatic and recreation benefits. And we need to work together to resolve potential conflicts, like those between boaters and anglers. And I'm glad to see Steve Hines from Trout Unlimited as one of the folks on the call today. And we worked very closely together. Resolving conflicts between resource agencies and recreational users, between the protection of traditional cultural uses and properties and other interests, between lake owners and downstream flows. We even ran into a situation on the Connecticut River where threatened endangered plants were growing in a dewatered bypass reach like the one that Tom described on the Deerfield River. With that, let me pass it over to Mark, who can chat about some of the changes in dam ownership.
Thanks, Bob. And I wanted to touch on this topic because I think it's critical to where we are today. You heard historically that a lot of progress was made collaborating with dam owners and independent power producers to develop settlement agreements that would accommodate the needs of the public for recreation and the environment. It is increasingly difficult to collaborate to develop settlement agreements, largely because of the change in ownership patterns of these energy products. The energy sector, for example, in 2023 saw over $250 billion in consolidations, with over 39 independent power producers being bought out by publicly traded companies. Just to come back to this individual project, this is the Moose River project that Pete Skinner referenced previously, and we are now working on the relicensing of that project, which began in 2021. This project was built and operated by Burroughs Paper Company that owned the mill that you see on the photograph on the left and the right, and has since been traded a number of times, bought then by Twin Rivers, bought by Cube Hydro, bought by Eagle Creek, now ultimately owned by Ontario Power. So this consolidation pattern is leading the power companies that we are trying to work with to have more corporate influence. They bring more lawyers to the table. They are less amenable to sitting down and trading ideas back and forth to try to reach resolution on these different issues and challenges. And I don't blame the employees who we work with on the relicensing process. Simply, they have more bosses and more management to deal with above them. So I understand their constraints, but it's a reality of where we are today. And I think Bob illustrated that there's a more complicated process in place, and that the energy companies are far more savvy about the relicensing process. And we need to be equally as savvy in order to be effective in achieving the outcomes that we're looking for. So glad to be able to read all the work that Pete and Bruce put into the Moose River project on the FERC docket, and to pick up that work today, hoping to secure even better outcomes for the public as we move forward. And I'd like to then introduce Kevin Mendek from the National Park Service, who's going to elaborate a little bit more on this topic and move into some additional topics. Kevin?
Thanks. Thanks, Mark. So in terms of the MPS hydro program, we kind of got involved with it in around 1990, just before the class of 93. And I think a lot of that was due in part to the whitewater industry lobbying to get funding for hydro positions in the Park Service. And at the time, when the Electric Consumers Protection Act amended the Federal Power Act, that eliminated the municipal preference that was associated with PURPA, and it allowed for a balancing which included environmental factors. And the Park Service, as a resource agency, we were defined in the regulations as one of the agencies that had to be consulted. So we had a seat at the table. And I happened to start with the Park Service in late 1990. And within about a month or so, Tom Christopher and the folks at New England Flow had me out to Tom's house in Massachusetts. And that was one of the first outside meetings I went to. And a couple of weeks after that, before leaf out, so we could see everything that was going on, they took me out around the deer fields, and I was in the back of an SUV, not the back seat. They actually threw me all the way in the back and bounced me around for a while, but we did get to see quite a bit. And going back to Bruce's point earlier on, and Pete's as well, you know, at the time, we were dealing with power companies that were local. They were part of the communities through which those rivers ran. You know, New England Power, Central Maine, Green Mountain Power, Niagara Mohawk, Connecticut Light and Power. So in a lot of cases, you know, we were dealing with the people who lived and worked in the community. They were part of the power companies, and it was a different kind of a process. You know, the companies in large part, they understood their environmental stewardship of where they worked was connected to where they lived. And we've had a significant amount of changes away from local ownership. Now, you know, initially Florida Power and Light, GDF sewage, pension funds, and now virtually all the Northeast Hydro is owned by a handful of companies. And those companies in turn are owned by multinationals. Very few hydros in this country in the Northeast are even owned by American companies. You know, there's a few long-term employees remain, but they may live locally, but their corporate offices and company philosophies have little or no connection to the community where the project is. You know, some of the early consultants are still around as well. And there's also been a trend towards reductions in the project boundary from land, you know, large landowners. Some of them were paper companies like International Paper. And by reducing these project boundaries, there's an additional burden of the host community maintaining the recreational facilities. We're looking now at what's coming as pending changes to the regulatory framework, which may further reduce the ability of the public to be effective. You know, FERC, on the other hand, has opened an Office of Public Participation in recent years, so they're reaching out to a lot of these companies as well. And in terms of the Park Service's involvement, you know, I've been involved with most of the settlements in the Northeast over the years. You know, the Penobscot and Kennebec Dam removals. Back then, in order to get the Penobscot removals through, the Bush administration made clear that they wanted to see no net loss in power generation even after the removal of the two dams. And we were able to accomplish that partly by repurposing and rewinding some of the turbines. And there was a raising on one of the dams. So eventually we were able to accomplish that. And that was one of the key pieces that helped us get forward. You know, International Paper on the Androscoggin, they owned a tremendous amount of land. Back then, again, a lot of these companies, they had large scale land protection in their, you know, that was the potential that we saw. If you can go to the next slide. Thanks. So again, the Park Service's role in these processes, and I've been asked even by FERC staff, you know, what is the Park Service's role? And we don't have conditioning authority. We don't have fee ownership or easements in a lot of the projects. So that really doesn't give us any formal conditioning authority like the Fish and Wildlife Service has with the 401 agencies. But as a federal resource agency, you know, in the early 90s, we were able to leverage and in a lot of cases promote the participation of some of the new and critical players such as New England Flow. You know, the initial class of 93, that was the focus, and they had literally dozens and dozens of applications that were coming up in one shot. So in addition to recreational access for boaters and anglers and whitewater flows and aesthetic flows, a relatively new element was brought to the table. I spent the first couple of months in my job reviewing draft applications from Niagara Mohawk and some of these other companies. And one of the things that kind of jumped out to me and a couple of folks that were doing this work as well, so these companies had a lot of land. And we started to put the idea of land protection on the table. And we were able to come up with some pretty significant land protection agreements, the Deerfield River and 15 Mile Falls on the Connecticut River in New Hampshire and Vermont. And one of the reasons the 15 Mile Falls settlement agreement came together and involved over 8,000 acres of land, a mitigation enhancement fund that started initially at $15 million. To date, we've given away over $22 million. But at the time, two of the main principals that were involved with New England Power, they told us that within about 8 or 9 months, TransCanada was going to be acquiring New England Power, and that there really may not be an opportunity for the type of settlement agreement that we were all collectively able to reach on the Deerfield. So we were able to get that done. And again, that really ties in with the local ownership. Those folks, they worked in the local community. They understood the stewardship role of these of their companies, and that really made a big difference. So again, back to the Park Service role. There's a lot of FERC projects that affect the Appalachian Trail, National Wild and Scenic River segments, and a lot of NPS units that folks don't typically associate with hydro, such as the Blackstone River Valley National Historical Park in Rhode Island, urban projects such as Patterson Great Falls in New Jersey, ongoing relicensing at the Lowell National Historic Park in Massachusetts. And while initially our role was on projects that didn't involve NPS units, over time that has shifted to primarily projects involving park units. And it wasn't a conscious decision. It was largely a function of that the Northeast has a tremendous concentration of parks. And the relicensings that were coming up involved a lot of those NPS units. So that's been partly our focus. But we're still involved on a number of other projects where there is no park unit role. We have a role of providing technical assistance, both to the other resource agencies that may have newer staff, to the NGOs. And we also consider part of our role, as we are technically neutral in these processes, to be assisting the applicant to put together a complete application. And that may be a function of requesting studies and getting to the point where we consider that FERC has enough information to properly issue a proper licensing decision. It's not always simple, but it does tend to work when you have all of the information at hand. If you want to just go to the next slide, please. So again, the upper left is the old Slater Mill Dam that's on the Blackstone. And although it's not advisable, the Park Service is acquiring this dam, and it's going to be it's not now, but it will be the first dam on the river. The Main Street Dam is being removed. That's just below that. There's a basin-wide program for fish passage. So again, this is the first place that water power was used to spin cotton in the colonies. So that's part of the ongoing fish restoration program on the Blackstone. At Lowell National Historical Park, there's a significant element of protecting historical and cultural resources. There's also a whitewater boating component on the river itself. The river goes through the city of Lowell in a series of canals. It's one of the earlier places where water power was used on a wide scale. And interestingly enough, the original Francis turbine is in situ at the park. We've also been involved with a number of aesthetic flow studies. We had one at Patterson Great Falls National Historic Park in Patterson, New Jersey. And that license has dramatically increased the times, duration, and magnitude of aesthetic flows. A new land for a new visitor center was given to the Park Service as part of that process. And when we had our aesthetic flow study in May of, I believe it was 2018, a large school group with yellow and green shirts was good enough to show up while we were doing that flow study, so that it really brought home in a single visual how important aesthetic flows are to a community. Next slide, please. On the left, there's the Great Falls of the Housatonic River in Connecticut. That's a recently designated wild and scenic river segment. It also abuts the Appalachian Trail. On the right is Pinnacle Overlook in Pennsylvania. That's part of a large-scale land agreement associated with a capacity amendment at Holtwood on the Susquehanna. And again, that's part of an area interest associated with the Captain John Smith Chesapeake National Historic Trail. And, you know, we're involved with current settlement agreements. There's one on the Mon Gap that involves the Upper Delaware National Wild Scenic River, Turner's Falls and Northfield Mountain, where there's a New England National Scenic Trail that runs through part of the Northfield Mountain Pump Storage Project. So there's really been a lot of opportunities for the Park Service to engage in these projects. And again, it really goes back to the foresight of some of the whitewater community and the other environmental organizations and the lawyers that were able to negotiate funding for the Park Service and to bring us in to help them with the process. And we're proud that we've been able to do that over these several decades. One of the things that has been alluded to is the length of these licenses. And for those of us that have been around this long, we kind of look back and say, geez, maybe a 40 or 50-year license might have been helpful, because here these projects are coming back around again in our careers. But we are in a better position with the sophistication and the input of a lot of the environmental organizations, which I think is going to carry this on well after the resource agencies will. So again, thank you for your work on all those.
Thanks, Kevin. I can attest to the fact that the National Park Service does a great job in helping to advocate for those studies that fill in the gaps. And on our case study here for the Pacific Gas and Electric Kirkhoff hydropower project, I can attest that National Park Service has helped us to get the right studies done for us to examine mitigations for access and whitewater boating flows. So thank you. So I'm quickly going to go over some things in the case study from this Kirkhoff project, which is located on the San Joaquin River Gorge here in California. We are in the middle of the relicensing process, and this relicensing process is following the integrated licensing, which has allowed stakeholders issues to be brought forward in early scoping. One of the main issues American Whitewater touched on during the first scoping meeting was the playthrough of flows that were negotiated and developed for the upstream project owned by Southern California Edison that follow a natural hydrograph and are beneficial to both aquatic species and whitewater recreation. So in other words, we're advocating for a basin scale opportunity for coordinated operations that will allow these flows that we've already negotiated and vetted to play through the PG&E project. Next slide. So on the Kirkhoff project, there's an example of stakeholder collaboration that I want to bring up that is near and dear to me, which is a tribal collaboration with North Fork Mono. Early on, when we were going through the study plan process and talking about study plans for the historic properties management plan, the North Fork Mono tribe was told that a trail that they've used since time immemorial to get to the San Joaquin River did not exist, basically because it was not mapped. So we had an opportunity to work with the Hydropower Reform Coalition to provide a grant that allowed them to do the work to map it and GIS the trail. And as a result, PG&E has revised their historic properties management plan to include these maps and acknowledge that indeed the historic trail does exist. Next slide. I wanted to go over a few of the tools that we use in relicensing today. Two of them are from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the Hydrological Engineering Center. They've been working on software programs that have been helping us model reservoir operations in their ResSim model. And also in DSS View, it is a program that allows us to plot, tabulate, edit, and manipulate historical flow data. So we can see what has been happening in the past, some of the flow hydrological flows that we don't want to see repeated in the future. And it helps us obviously fill in some data gaps. One of the data gaps that we have on the Kirkhoff Hydropower project is understanding the public safety aspect. There was a drowning on the San Joaquin River that happened back in 2018, and it was a result of the peaking of PG&E on this river. And so we don't want that repeated. So through this process of the ILP and having these scoping topics being able to be out on the table and discussed ahead of time, we were able to ask for an additional study, which was basically a stage height discharge study that indicated that in less than an hour at the main area where most people recreate on the San Joaquin River Gorge, and within an hour, the stage height can change as much as 10 feet. So now we've got that information, and we are in the process when we go into negotiating mitigations to get that fixed for this next relicensing. So now quickly, I'm going to go into what I'm calling what's ahead, our fishbowl. And I'm going to throw it to Alex, who was, when we were discussing this program, was telling us about a crypto mining operation that popped up by his hydropower project. So Alex, let me turn it to you. Tell us what's going on.
Sure. So one of the things that is different about me than everyone else in this panel is I'm the only person who's on the other end of the licensing program in my professional life. So I work in private industry. I report to any number of different agencies. So one of the things that's flooring about this process is I've never in my professional life come across another agency where the industry is so openly deceptive. So we see things such as, license agreements that are made which have no possibility of being honored, trails on property they don't own, will never own, still don't own. And then also on the back end, 40 years later, with minimal enforcement, people just getting creative. So as cryptocurrency really peaked out around 2018 and now going forward, we started seeing these trailers, Connex boxes showing up at hydro facilities in my area in northern New York. And really only through knowing operators could we get a glimpse into what was inside, which turned out to be, these were mobile computing centers. So they mine Bitcoin, which is basically a server. It doesn't really matter what the point is they are sucking down power at an incredible rate. So by putting them directly hardwired into the facility, in some cases, these dams were being taken completely offline. So whereas they were licensed to be a public resource, providing the public with cheap power as a public benefit, they were now completely corporatized, privatized, and there was no more benefit going to the public. In the intervening periods, we have been going back and forth on the docket with FERC. It has been a challenge just to get these companies to admit how they're wired in. Any sort of change to one of these wiring systems requires an updated figure to explain how the system works. For those of you who aren't familiar, dams are not built prescriptively. They are built individually as individual engineering project and approved such. So when a change happens, there's a administrative process that has to go through to approve that. So there should be no surprise that one of these facilities is showing up. And it certainly should not be a question of whether or not it is pulling power from behind the meter. So in these facilities, what we're seeing is that these companies are helping themselves to free power. It is not like it is bouncing across a meter going off the grid and they're paying a reduced rate or anything like that. They're literally getting it for free. This has been the most egregious version of license, deception or manipulation or just outright stealing power. But across the board, compared to what we see in other regulatory environments, these hydropower facilities are pretty much running with abandon. And as has been alluded to previously, what we see in the relicense process very often is a pseudo-scientific industry, which also supports a lot of these relicense studies, which are highly objective and often somewhat manipulated in a way that, as someone in the private sector, you would never ever see. The way in which the rest of industry collects samples, reports, and is held to account is very different in hydro.
Thank you, Alex. Another big thing coming on the horizon is all the aging infrastructure. I mean, 20, 30 years ago, these structures were new or newer, and now they're old and getting older. So let me turn it to Bob first to just kind of discuss the impacts of aging infrastructure.
I think, Alex, you see it on the project you're working on, on the Moose River, where, these powerhouses that now have crypto mines in them are about to fall into the river as all the concrete gets deteriorated. A number of projects that I work on, the penstocks and power canals are failing. The economics aren't there to be able to maintain these projects, and dam owners are increasingly looking to decommission these projects because they can no longer make enough money off of them. I know, Mark, you run into some of this with some of these RPS credits and things, but I think, looking ahead, we need to focus more on getting these dams out of rivers. FERC at this point is unwilling to require a dam removal unless the dam owners agree. And that's an issue that we're challenging currently in the DC circuit. And we're going to be bringing more of these challenges to try to hold the dam owners responsible for cleaning up their messes rather than leaving them in the river with no one responsible and public safety, blocking fish passage. I see that as sort of charting the next direction for us. I don't know, Mark, maybe you want to say a little bit about greenwashing or some of the other aspects of climate change.
Thanks, Bob. I wanted to also touch on what we're seeing in terms of the geographic distribution of projects right now. And the aging infrastructure is a very real topic for projects located in built communities. So a number of us are working on hydro relicensings in very developed areas. Bob touched on them, Kevin touched on them, whether it's New Jersey or Lewiston, Maine. So many communities that are in these watersheds are economically disadvantaged, are widely diverse. They lack the resources to engage in the hydropower relicensing proceeding. So I'm increasingly kind of turning to all of you to think about how we can support those communities. And the FERC Office of Public Participation was recently kind of launched to help support the public interest engagement in these processes. But, an old colleague of mine used to tell me that river conservation was a success when communities would take their park benches along the river and turn them to actually face the river. And if you know what I mean, if you've ever been along a river walk and those park benches have their back to the river, we need to change that dynamic. And so many hydropower projects are located in communities where there used to be industry, there used to be mills, there used to be tech
think we lost your audio.
We
Yeah,
might
maybe-
have-
I think we lost Mark. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I can fill in some of that again to some of these old industries. A lot of the national park units are some of these old and historic structures. Many of them have hydro within them. And in terms of the Park Service involvement, there's 20 different types of national park units. It's not just national parks that are associated with the FERC process. For example, on the Blackstone, there are 11 FERC projects in various stages. And, we provide assistance to the parks as well as to resource agencies and NGOs. And we're fortunate that in the case with the Blackstone, the park superintendent and their staff are very active, have been really fast learners, and are fully engaged with the process. That's part of the challenge, because in a lot of these communities, just the learning curve to step in and engage in the FERC process is very significant. And that's where I think FERC's Office of Public Participation is attempting to address that issue. But it's still also up to us, a lot of the practitioners, to assist anyone that wants to engage in the process. And unfortunately, it is a high bar with engaging effectively.
Thankfully, technology has helped that in some ways. Many of these meetings now can be done virtually in forums like this. So for some people in local government who otherwise would have to travel, people who have real jobs outside of this, like myself, we still can call in. It's not like the days of having to go to a town hall in a small rural community, but it's also a double-edged sword. That means that it's very easy to hold more meetings, and kind of that bar can still be created through quantity, even if you can access them relatively easily.
Okay, and one of the things that I've been embroiled here in California, and Bob as well, is defending State Clean Water Act, a 401 authority. So Bob, in a minute, so we can allow a little bit of time for questions from our audience, can you summarize what's going on with the Clean Water Act?
I think so. For folks who have been doing this a while, it's frustrating dealing with FERC. You do the studies, you produce the data, and at the end, you feel like they have a thumb on the scale for the hydro industry. And increasingly, and I think to some extent this happened after 2016, we've increasingly looked to the state to fill in that gap. And I see the states as really the ones who are going to be defending clean water. And frankly, what's envisioned by Section 401 of the Clean Water Act. FERC and the Federal Power Act is really designed to protect power and to consider non-power. But the states really don't have to do that. The states are the ones who make sure that these projects are meeting state water quality standards. And we are pressing them, and they're assuming this role as really the guardians there. And I would even extend that to the area of dam removal, which is, in the litigation that we're involved with, we're pressing the states to be able to require these dams to be removed from the rivers, and to think broadly about what the role is and their responsibility. So I see that as the next vanguard. While much of our past has been focused on FERC and their role in balancing these interests, the states are really the ones who are stepping up. And I think that's what I see ahead.
I think it's really important for state agencies to understand that on a dam by dam level, they have so many more resources to bring to this than FERC does. FERC is highly overworked. Their ability to go more than surface level on these is really limited in a way that the states have the ability to really fully understand a project and get better outcomes for everyone involved.
One thing that that I don't think anybody should forget is the fact that nuclear power plants are required to maintain a decommissioning fund. That may change the economics of that kind of project. And a decommissioning fund for a dam might change the way they build them in the first place. And secondly, also, change the economics overall of the undertaking. But I think it's just as important for hydro projects on a river as for a nuclear power plant. I can't fathom why they shouldn't have some equity there. In terms, I see in the chat room, aesthetic flow studies referenced. That we in New York have had a few of those, and we have expertise available on those issues, and we feel it's very important up here. And given the fact that the very first Moose River case that I was involved with, we had suggested a bottom tap and a bottom exit so that the intake obstructions that you see in our pictures wouldn't be there. And that was a long time ago, over 30 years ago. We knew that that was possible, and some are already built, and there's no reason this shouldn't be on the table with any new project.
Some of these projects, I think of one like Rumford Falls, and I know Steve has taken the lead on West Canada Creek that I'm working on. Extraordinary waterfalls, frankly, have been dewatered by these hydropower projects. And part of our work has certainly been focused on, trying to put the flows back over, some of the largest waterfalls in the east, this side of Niagara.
So you guys, I'd like to acknowledge that it's about time. I'd like to maybe offer that we'll go maybe another 10 minutes because there are a few questions that I think our experts can respond to. And I apologize for going over time. We tried really hard to not do this, but if you have to go, thank you. And if you can stay a little bit, we're going to take a couple of questions. The first one, Tom, I'd love to know more about the orchid that got transplanted. Could you tell me more about it? We have a similar case with the FERC relicensing we're working on here for CRC for Turner's Falls. And if you could respond pretty briefly, Tom, it'd be awesome.
Sure. It was an orchid it was called Plantera flava, that was found growing in a dry section of the Deerfield River from Harriman down to Sherman Dam. And the actual dryway had become wooded, and this endangered orchid was growing there. And this almost killed the settlement agreement. What happened was the boaters were very interested in kayaking this river. It had a lot of vertical drop. And when the orchid was discovered, fortunately, the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources, in their wisdom, had the orchid transplanted. I think there were 125 different colonies to a more suitable habitat. And we left the vegetation in the driveway. And one of the things that we agreed to is that we would not take that section of the river and use it for kayaking. And that was also sort of a compromise, so that that section of the Deerfield could be used to become another established trout fishery. So that's how that happened. And kudos to Vermont Agency of Natural Resources in that decision.
Thanks, Tom. We will go to a few more questions, but before we do, Angie, just want to mention that we have one more webinar in our series.
We do. Our final session in the series is going to be in a few weeks on April 24th at 9 a.m. Pacific, noon Eastern. It's going to be a great session. We're going to be looking at hydropower's ability to provide ancillary services that bring benefits to the energy market and grid, including baseload power, grid regulation, flexibility, black start capability, and more. So we hope you join us for that. And we have Hill Ballier and Abhishek Somani, who are going to be joining us to present at that session. So register if you haven't.
Cool. And then quickly, a few of these questions. Hannah asked, is there public access to the ResSim and DSS flow models? I'm not
Yes,
sure who'd be
Angie,
the,
yeah, Angie put the link there. The,
Okay.
So if you follow that, you can go to it and you just go to the software link. And there is a variety of tools that you can use.
oh, great. Thank you. Matt, I think we're responding to your questions. We'll respond to them. You asked a historical one about the Federal Power Act. And you had one more, recommended resources for design or retrofit of free-flowing diversion structures for hydro projects. Case studies where where this was pursued during a process when dam removal was not viable.
Yeah, if you have any additional resources or can provide information that I think it would be helpful for a lot of people to understand the differences between the regulatory frameworks and how that progressed, because there's some really key points there, and I'm just wondering if there's a good summary document that we could reference or something for that.
I don't know if someone has a suggestion for that besides maybe going to HRC's library. Okay, Nina has a follow-up question to Tom. So the area did not end up getting flooded when you asked for higher flows, ? You just transplanted the orchid, but flows didn't change?
Well, there were no flows through that section. All the water was then being transported from Harriman down through a penstock.
Okay. Nikolaj Suchi says, what's driving the change in how people see the resources provided by the river? Is there a change in demographics, increase in recreation, a growing appreciation for nature? What are the biggest factors changing the way we think about resources and opportunities? That's kind of a big question.
Yeah.
Yeah. We might have to go offline, or maybe we can ask, I'm not sure, maybe we can send you some resources offline for that.
One
Matt
thing
asks-
I didn't mention in my presentation is how important it is to have people like Alex or Steve Massero and others on the ground at the sites to identify violations of the licenses, because they happen all the time. And the other thing is that during construction, the company may have plans for the project, but it is the contractor and the subs that are actually doing work on the ground. We came on to Eggers Falls one time on a Sunday. The holes were there and plugged, ready for dynamite to blow it up. Had nothing to do with the operation of the plant. We called FERC the first thing Monday morning, and they stopped construction. A similar thing happened on the Black River when Steve noticed that the size of the canal was many times the size that the permit allowed. Again, we called FERC first thing Monday morning. They stopped construction on that project as well. So many slips between the design on a piece of paper and the actual activities on the ground that take place are many. And I can't tell you how important it is to have local people who go there, maybe paddlers, and they've got to be aware of what's going on and say, this doesn't look right. And that is key to the better outcomes. But like so many things, we were able to negotiate a on-site monitor during construction at Costerville. And they, of course, wanted to cut all the trees so they could drive straight to the river. And Steve said, no, that you'll have to go around those trees, and those trees are still there. So, it's important to stay really au courant with what's going on the site.
Thank
If
you.
I could take a stab at Miko's question, I think the most important element to that question is not accepting the status quo. One of the most complicated things about a long-term license is the local knowledge, the understanding of what the resource is becomes what it is as they know it. So the memory of a place without that dam is gone. Bob mentioned West Canada Creek. Trenton Falls section was something that was so cherished. It was one of the stops on the way to Niagara Falls, and people, thought it was more special than Niagara Falls before it was dammed up. Today, public access to it is eliminated. It maybe happens a couple days a year, and only recently, because the relicense was coming up, was that seen as sort of maybe a way to play things off, and strategically allowed. So reimagining, trying to understand what was there before and what could be there in the future is really important. In a lot of the filings that we use, we look for historical photos and other things that we can do to kind of broaden the mind in terms of what the possibilities at a site are.
Yeah, it's important to note that the FERC's baseline for analysis is existing conditions. So they are looking at continuing impacts. And again, it's important not to limit your requests of mitigation of any type to whatever you can think of. And again, that's where we initially, decades ago, brought in some of the concepts associated with settlements agreements, just, of and by themselves, as well as land protection elements within those settlement agreements. That hadn't been on a lot of the hydro operators' radar screens, as well as scheduled flows for whitewater boating. So we put them there and got it onto FERC's radar. And in many cases, it worked.
Before we wrap, I guess I'd like to make a comment about the future of hydropower and impacts of climate change. Extreme weather events, whether it's the droughts that they had in California that were shutting down hydro projects, the extremely high flows, which are above the capacity, and the fluctuations we've seen over the years. In terms of the demand for hydropower, California, Tree can attest to, is seeing negative power prices, where wind and solar, referencing Pete's comments here, have actually, the demand for energy during certain daytime hours it is less than the supply, forcing prices negative. There's a need for dispatchable power to balance off the energy grid, but much of what's out there is run-of-river power and is of little value, and I think will become less valuable in the future. Eventually, I think this will put more pressure on the economics and could lead to more decommissioning. Mark, I don't know if you want to say anything about energy storage, but there is a changing environment, I think, that is certainly affecting the future of hydropower.
I'll build on it briefly, Bob, but we all know that renewable energy is coming online more and more frequently across our region. Wind and solar is a relatively intermittent renewable source. Hydropower is an opportunity to store some of that energy. Some of these plants have storage reservoirs, can hold that water and release it when the grid needs it most, providing benefits to the grid. That's a challenge for many of us that have been advocating for hydro projects to be operated in a run-of-river mode. Run-of-river means water coming in, water goes out. Storage provides environmental benefits to the grid in reducing the amount of fossil fuel-based generation that we need. The other trend we've seen across New England is hydropower projects putting battery storage within their project boundary. Massachusetts has a pretty robust but growing energy marketplace for storage, and I know states are looking to expand the financial credits they provide for energy companies that can provide some storage benefits to the grid. I think these changes are going to impact hydropower projects and the financial viability of different types of projects as we move forward.
Well, thank you, Mark. And I think we should probably wrap, even though there might be some more questions coming in. So thank you, everyone, for attending. Thank you for the good questions. Thank you to our 9 panelists, our cast of thousands that we so appreciate for your history, what you've contributed, and what you hopefully will do in the future for us. So thanks again, and we'll do a follow-up. Please fill out the survey if you can. Take a minute to let us know how we did. We'll send a note that we posted the recording, and if you know folks who have not been able to attend, they can check it out later. So thank you so much. Thanks to the Park Service for those who are here. Thank you, Kevin, and your folks.
Thank you, Risa.
Great job.
Thank
Great,
you.
great program.
Thank you,
today.
Risa.
Thanks,
Great
everyone. Thanks for
privilege to
coming.
be on with so many amazing people. It's great.